Everyone in the industry will tell you just how difficult it is to publish genuine literary fiction, especially at the moment. Usually after the initial publicity, sales fall off and it's a very disappointing business for everybody. Adrian has completely bucked this trend, which we're very, very happy about. Last week in the office, I personally sold the very last copy of Midfield Dynamo. Love Notes is nearing the end of its second edition, and soon we'll be reprinting a sabbatical in Leipzig. And it's particularly satisfying because these sales are coming from people coming into Lilliput and asking for Adrian's work, by title, by name, which means that it's spreading through word of mouth, which for me is really the true mark of longevity and success. I also have the huge privilege of being Adrian's editor. The relationship between writer and editor is a little bit like the relationship between an architect and an engineer. The writer, like the architect, has all kinds of fanciful notions, and the editor, like the engineer, has to explain what's actually possible. Perhaps unsurprisingly, with Adrian, the relationship is reversed. His work deals in profound, solid, emotional truth, concrete things that go beyond many received notions of technical narrative or that kind of thing. Editors always talk about the moment they realise that they've come across something special. As soon as they pick up the manuscript, they know, and I've been trying to put my finger on what that is. And I think it's the realization that you're going to learn something, that the text is going to change your idea about what's possible. We're very lucky to have Greg Baxter here tonight. He's a very highly regarded writer. He wrote A Preparation for Death, The Apartment, and Munich Airport. A Preparation for Death is an unforgettable statement. Perhaps it's the kind of book that every writer should be forced to attempt before they're allowed to embark on a novel. It really established Greg as an entirely authentic voice. And the two highly acclaimed novels that followed have cemented his place as a thinking person's writer. He's been writing and teaching for years, shaping the way we think about literature and what its boundaries are. Greg and Adrian share one important element. I mean, their work's very different, obviously, but they both manage to approach the concrete realities of life and art without ever indulging in sentimentality. Anyway, Greg's the perfect person, I think, to introduce Adrian. Adrian was once his pupil a long time ago, and they're good friends. It's a friendship based, I believe, on the one true foundation, which is mutual respect. Greg Baxter.
Well, thank you, Sean. Thank you very much, Greg. Lovely to hear all these lovely things being said. The last time I was here, the Love Notes from a German building site came out, and it was my first book, and I was exceptionally nervous. And I can't say I'm any less nervous right now, because in the time since, though two books have appeared, I've been pretty much behind the computer promoting them. So seeing people is really, really nerve-wracking, but it's also lovely. So thank you all, everyone, for coming. I appreciate it greatly. I've got notes written in here, so this will be quite kind of, ordered. I want to thank the Hodges Vegas as well for hosting the event. And I'd like to thank Greg, who I think he pretty much said everything that I need to say in terms of our, our friendship and how we met and all this kind of stuff. And I'm very, very pleased and very, very happy that he agreed to come here tonight and introduce the book. It's very meaningful for me that something like that could happen. So thank you, Greg. I'd just quickly like to thank the Arts Council of Ireland as well, who have supported me for a number of years now with visual artists bursaries and budget awards and things like that. And these things are crucial if you're trying to write and if you're trying to think, because you need space, I'd like to thank the Centre Culturel Ríordáin as well, and Literature Ireland, who enabled a bursary for me at the end of 2020 where I more or less worked on this book for about a month, and I met McLaughlin as well. I think he's just gone. And I'd like to thank Keaton Contemporary Arts. I'd also like to thank the writers who blurbed my book. It's sort of a strange thing to be asked to do. It takes a bit of work, and I appreciate Niamh Campbell, Colin Bean, Kevin Power, Rob Doyle, Joe Lloyd and Colleen Parsons' contribution for reading the book and blurbing it so kindly, incredibly kindly. It's such a strange moment when a book goes out to these blurbers, because it's as if the thing has left the laboratory and is sort of touching reality. And it's one of the many nerve-wracking moments when you're a writer. It's like, how is this going to go? And now I'm at the next nerve-wracking moment where it's going out into the world, and reviewers will be able to have a look and make their judgments. I'd like to thank my family for coming up tonight. Thank you very, very much. I won't say too much because I might get emotional, so just thank you very, very much to my family. And I'd like to thank, again, I shouldn't have put that after the family because it's another emotional one. I'd like to thank Niamh Dunphy as well, who can't be here tonight. So thank you, Niamh. And the funny thing is, before I launched Love Notes last time, I remember Niamh and I were sitting outside a bar and we were going through the thank yous. And so I was listening to all the thank yous, and then when I stood up to do the thank yous, I forgot to thank her. So she reminded me of that the next day. She said she knew there was no point reminding me that night because I definitely wouldn't remember. So thank you, Niamh. I'd like to thank Sagarra Press, who are publishing this book in the UK, particularly Colin Bean and Peter Strauss for taking an interest in my work. They're not here tonight, but thank you to them. And lastly, I'd like to thank the Lilliput Press. I can't thank them enough. I can pretty safely say that if they hadn't taken Love Notes from a German building site, that I would still be working on it now. And all other books would not have appeared. And I wouldn't have had the interactions with Sean Farrell, my editor, or the editor that I've worked with, from whom I've learned an awful lot about writing. I remember there's sort of two stages where my learning was at a very, very steep level. The first was with Greg 10, 12 years ago, and the most recent now is with Lilliput, learning how to write and how to do and how to think about what you're doing as well, whilst also leaving things open and free to actually get on with it, I'd like to thank Ruth Hanlon, who is absolutely brilliant. Anyone who's worked with her in publishing will know how, I suppose a lot of people use this word awesome, but she's quite an awesome force in terms of what she can do and how she does it and how well she does it. I'd like to thank the board of Lilliput Press as well, and I would like to sincerely thank Antony Farrell, who can't be here tonight, but his encouragement to me has meant an awful lot actually. And I would say this particular book here is, I think of it very much as a Lilliput book. Because before I started writing it, I used to, whenever I come back to Dublin, I used to go down to, I'd pop over to Lilliput before I go down to Longford, essentially, and myself and Antony would go down for a glass of beer in Watches or something like that, and he'd be telling me all about these, just different stories about different writers, and he'd sort of push books into my hands, John Moriarty and particularly Hubert Butler, and these thinkers essentially then prepared a kind of ground from which this started coming from. So if you look at the back of this book, there's a range of references essentially, and a lot of them are Lilliput books. So thank you to Lilliput for not just for publishing, but for actually, I suppose, being part of the creative process of writing. I hope I haven't forgotten anyone, but if I have, apologies. I think that's it. Thank you, Peter, for coming as well. So I'm just going to read a little bit from part one. So this is Nikolai Lobachevsky, this Russian geometer, which is basically a mathematician of surveying, a mathematician of
well, when you start reading and you haven't read much, you often encounter the opinion that prevails about an author before you actually meet the text. I grew up in a bookish Hibernian household. I can't quite pinpoint when I first heard about Somerville and Ross. I could have been told about Somerville and Ross by Francis Wyndham, Jean Rhys's champion. I could have been told by Carl Miller, who used to come to the house, the man who edited The Listener and founded the LRB. I could have been told by Nell Dunn, great 60s writer, who used to give me books all the time. Her father, Sir Philip Dunn, was a hunting man, and he had Somerville and Ross in his library. I know, because I saw them, the stories of an Irish RM, and I read them. What was interesting about what people told me about Somerville and Ross was the duality. These people, whomever introduced me to these writers said, look, there's the good books, like The Real Charlotte, okay? That's good stuff. I remember buying it and reading it. And then there's the popular, crowd-pleasing stuff, the Irish RM stories, technically competent, complacent, lightweight, crowd pleasers. Now, you have to remember this is the 60s when I'm receiving this information. The 60s is when the bourgeoisie are getting a duffing up. The RM stories, this is before the television production, the RM stories are vanished age stuff, Edwardian, pre-partition. It's the world of antimacassars and spittoons and forelock tugging paddies, all of which the 60s are sweeping aside. I was also told very clearly in the 60s that Somerville and Ross had it easy. Several decades later, more than I care to count, I was invited to become Martina Devlin's supervisor. She was doing a PhD in literary practice at Trinity. My role was to give counsel on a novel, hers, about Edith Somerville. This is the novel published today, Edith. So the supervisory role obliged me to plunge into these writers, particularly Somerville, for the focus of Edith is the time that comes after the glory years. Ross is dead. War of Independence, etc. is on. She considers herself Irish, but she is living in a world where there are people who may not consider herself Irish in the early 1920s. She has a house, she has cares, she needs money, and as the novel narrates, she tries to make herself into a different kind of writer to the one that she was before, a kind of writer who will make a lot of money. Those of you who are writers will know that this is something that we all do. This is a truth. We endlessly think, God, if I could just rejig myself a bit, I'd make a killing. She decides to move from being a prose writer to being a playwright. Fatal ambition, particularly when you remember what the critic Kenneth Tynan said. Writing a play, he said, is the hardest thing you can do with a fountain pen. And he is right. It is extremely hard, much harder to write theatre than prose. As I read the various drafts of this book, I remembered what I'd been told and believed when I was callow, and compared that with what I was discovering through talking to Martina, through reading her drafts. It's always a chastening experience to collide with your idiocy, and it reminds you, be skeptical. This thing, they didn't have it easy, Somerville and Ross, or Somerville alone, and the RM stories just being crowd pleasers. I also learned both of those assertions were untrue. They didn't have it easy, And the stories are more than just mere crowd pleasers. They're really remarkable pieces of engineering. The novel, Edith, I assure you, I know it better than almost any other book, even one of my own. It's short, it's sharp, crisp, effective, lucid, rich with insight and historical detail. It performs a public duty. It presents a person, Somerville, to the public, who is a person who has not been seen enough in public, in my opinion. This is an act of literary revisionism, or a political act, if you prefer. If this country wants to be a mature, first-class, progressive European state, it's going to have to embrace all its children, both the right kind of child and the wrong kind of child. But for me, the book's greatest virtue is that it is a plausible and realistic evocation of the life and practice of a writer, and particularly the business side, stroke creative side. The two things are mingled. We have biographies of writers which enunciate the sort of nitty-gritty of their writing lives, and these work because the biographer has stuff, documents and letters from agents and all those materials that they've accumulated during research, which they can deploy to tell the story from an external point of view. Novel can't do that. It has to communicate the writer's practice and business life, the struggle, through an understanding of the internal life. I know of only a handful of really good examples of literature that does this. There's Camus' story, The Artist at Work. There are the Pat Hobby stories by Scott Fitzgerald. And I suppose we have to include Mr. Knausgaard. I'm sure there are others. But it's a very difficult thing to do, to communicate the internal world of the writer and the business of making. That's why it's not done very often, and it's done brilliantly here, trust me. And the key to the novel's success is that it doesn't shirk failure. It's not about success, it's about failure. And most writers' lives consist mostly of failure. It also manages brilliantly, which I would have thought is nearly impossible, it manages brilliantly to bring Mr. and Mrs. George Bernard Shaw to life on the page. So now, please remember, as Vladimir Ilyich Lenin said somewhere, at least according to my father, whatever else it is, the production of art is always an economic act. So the final part of the publishing process is the purchasing process. And this is where you come in, dear esteemed lovers of literature, if you haven't already done so. The till is over there. It's manned, I think, by books upstairs. Go by. And now, Lise-Ann McLaughlin is somewhere here.
This is a short little bit from earlier in the book when Drishane House, where Edith was born and where she grew up. It's being raided by an IRA gang, and it's quite intimidating and frightening. And they're all in the kitchen, and it's the middle of the night, and Edith is sent to get jewellery. They've come obviously for money and jewellery and arms and horses and whatever they can get for their cause. So she has to go upstairs to get some jewellery, and she's accompanied by a young volunteer. And this encounter has a lasting effect on Edith and the rest of her journey and story. Edith walks out of the kitchen, followed by the young volunteer, past the back stairs, the pantry and the glory hole, along a dim corridor. She leads him to the dining room, lifting the hall lamp and passing. Her destination is a sideboard. She places the lamp on its polished surface and opens a drawer, removing a cloth bag. In the mirror above the sideboard, she glances at her captor's reflection. He can't be more than 18 or 19, composed entirely of angles, his corduroy trousers bagging against hips and backside. Her eyes flick from his blackened face to her own. She looks ghastly. "They get under your skin, a pet dog," he says. "I had one growing up. Lucky, I called him. I loved that dog like a brother. Everywhere I went, Lucky went." She glances at him. "What's your name?" shaking his head. No names, the captain warned us. Oh, country voice. Where are you from? Kerry? I'm not allowed to say. They say Kerry is rebel country. He snuffles. Even the hens lay bullets there. That's what the captain says. A determined sort of a fellow, isn't he? Hero worship flashes from his moss green eyes, their colour emphasising the black streaks on his face. The captain's a man who can think things out. He was at the university, above in Dublin, till the troubles came upon us. He has death in his eyes. If you stay with him, you'll end up dead too. We give as good as we get. What is in that bag, man? Some jewellery. Your captain can sell it. Well, it can't be much in a small bag like that. He'll want more. What else have we got? Nothing. Look, I don't doubt you have your reasons, but this will end badly for you. Go home to your family. Your mother must be at her wit's end with worry. I have no home. The towns have burnt us out. Me and the boys, we live in like foxes, in caves and dugouts. He tugs at the drawer she's closed. The drawers are empty. We're as poor as church mice. All we have are the house and land. Nobody is poor that has a house and land. His eyes sweep the room and catch on the matching candelabra. He yanks open another drawer, finds a tablecloth, and tucks the silverware into its folds. It must be a tough life for you. Don't you miss sleeping in a bed and eating a meal without looking over your shoulder? Freedom can't be won without some hardship, so the captain says. Is he strict, your captain? He likes us column men to shave regular and keep ourselves clean, ma'am, when we can. And how do you manage to bathe if you're living in dugouts and caves, Edith asks. We take a dip in a stream, while one of us keeps a lookout. And what do you do for towels? We roll in the grass. Enough of that blarney. Those candlesticks aren't enough. Where is your tin? He prefers cash. Get me the tin when you can, says he. No doubt, but we have none. You can't draw blood from a stone. It is best to give him. They'll get him to leave. The longer the lads are here, the greater the chances of something. I don't know. Wouldn't like to say. But something. She finds a canteen of cutlery and silver-plated egg cups. What else? Nothing. I told you, we have nothing else to give. You're not the first Republicans to pay us a social call. It's for your own good, I am telling you. This won't satisfy him. Edith meets his boy-bright eyes. This is no life. Are you trying to be a hero? Ireland will gobble you up, and it gobbles up blood sacrifices. She will suck you dry. He stares at her, his pupils widened. The taste of blood gets into your mouth. Once it's there, nothing shifts it. But there's no going back now. I've crossed the line. Edith feels compelled to recover this boy, who's not yet a man. I noticed you were limping. Are you injured? No, ma'am, thank God. Is it your boots? I did a swap with me dad the day I left. His were new. He thought he was doing me a favour, but I'm crippled with them. One of my brothers left a pair here the last time he stayed over. They might fit you. She leads them to the boot cupboard at the bottom of the back stairs. Aylmer's knee-length hunting boots are near the front. The boy sits on the floor to try on Aylmer's boots. Holy mackerel, ma'am, are you really giving them to me? I am. Edith notices his socks are soaking. You'll get chilblains wearing wet socks. I don't have a spare pair, ma'am. Nobody knits like me, ma, but I left the spares after me, clearing out by a nose ahead of the oxys, the auxiliaries, the black and tans, the RUC. It's only a matter of time before military or police catch up with this boy. Will he be shot wearing her brother's boots or hanged? The boy peeks up at her shyly. Can I ask you something, ma'am? Of course. I heard something over the summer I'd love to believe, but I don't know if I can. They say there was a butterfly found in Clare, striped green, white and orange. The people are calling it the Republican butterfly. Could such a thing be true? The trust on his face makes Edith pause. Anything is possible, she says.
It's hard to know where a book comes from, but there are patterns and repetitions, and somehow it comes together. Lise-Ann is a neighbour of mine, and I discovered that she played Sally Knox in the 1980s TV series with Peter Boyle.
Child.
And I used to quiz her about that. The little factoid I remember from that is she had to learn how to ride side saddle for it. And then in my mother-in-law Betty Murphy's house, I discovered in the bookcase where all the special books were kept with the glass-fronted bookcase, a lovely old edition of the Irish RM. And I'd never realised it, but Edith did all the illustrations herself. So when we look at those images of Flurry Knox or Slipper or that hapless Major Yates, they're how she envisaged the characters. But probably if I was to go back far enough, when I was going out with David, he brought me to Castle Townsend. And he actually brought me there specifically to see the Harry Clark windows in St. Barahan's church. And it's impossible to be in Castle Townsend, as people who are here, like, who have homes there or who visit there. You can't be there and not be aware of Edith. She lived in Drashan House, this magnificent building at the top of the hill. She played the organ in St. Barahan's all her life virtually. She commissioned those Harry Clark windows, and she's buried in the graveyard there, the most beautiful graveyard in Ireland, overlooking Castlehaven Bay, in a plot next to her long-time collaborator and second cousin, Violet Martin, who wrote as Martin Ross. So it all came together, and I felt I would try and write a book about her, and Edith is the result. So thank you to everybody who made it happen along the way, to all the people I spoke to about it. I can see some of you here. I'm afraid to name you in case I leave someone out, but I'm looking at you. I can see you. And thank you to Carlo Gébler, for talking Edith with me for 4 years. And what he gave me, working on this book with me, was a sense that something that I was making up in my imagination could be real, because he treated the making up things I was saying as real, and that puts flesh on the bones of your characters. So thank you for that. And also for that great masterclass in writing a book. I was actually thinking I should be recording this and robbing it. Thanks also to Antony Farrell for reading the book and for being interested in it, because frankly, after I finished it, I thought, how on earth am I going to persuade any publisher to take a punt on a book about a 64-year-old woman who, as I discovered, probably wasn't in a relationship with Martin Ross, despite that being kind of common currency, and people sidling up to me often and saying, was she in a relationship with a writing partner? I don't believe that she was. So how was I going to make her interesting? Well, that's not for me to say. But thank you very much. Thank you for coming, and enjoy the rest of the evening.
You know that phrase, you should never judge a book by its cover? Well, I have to say, this is the cover of Most Beautiful Woman. Yes. They're here. And I think Ada is beautiful in many ways. She is just such a wonderful individual, amazing scholar. I can't believe that this is the output from somebody who, in lockdown, who I think poured her soul into it. There are so many colleagues that I have come across who said they work here because of Ida. There are so many people who have so many amazing things to say to her. I was actually, even though I can't play any sport myself, I had to go to a golf tournament between different universities recently, and there was Ida in the middle of it. You know, in actually a society that's both for academic and professional staff. Another thing I think that's really important, that you actually are about everyone in this university.
I have to confess, ladies and gentlemen, Ida always made me nervous. Gorgeous person, wonderful character, wonderful to meet as a member of staff, but she always frightened the living daylights out of me. Not as much as the ox, who frightened the living daylights out of her, which is saying something. But anyway, she's just such an extraordinarily accomplished, integrated, rounded human being, talent on so many different directions, as the book and her life testify. But I was coursing through the book very happily, immersed in her century, feeling that it wasn't just the case of explaining her century, but actually drawing me into seeing things through her eyes. I lived through a good bit of it, 3/4 of it, but seeing things that I hadn't ever seen or been introduced to through her eyes. And I was going grand and really delighted to be asked to launch the book until I got to page 234. And this is what, you see, everybody who knows Edith knows she's a person with really very strong opinions. And she doesn't hold back. She's a wonderful diplomat, but occasionally the mask slips. And here's what I read. Almost all Irish women feel the need to change the hair colour they were born with. I had a hair appointment to get my roots done. And I thought, I can't do that because no, I'm going to have to go grey gracefully rather than stay blonde disgracefully. And then it got worse because practically everyone parts her hair down the middle, regardless as to whether it suits them or not. Now, I arrived here early, and if you had seen me in the bathroom with my comb trying badly to stop my hair from naturally parting in the middle. So you are an inspiration, but quite terrifying at times. But this extraordinary woman has, of course, an extraordinary story to tell. And the book is a marvel. It's a wonderful thing that it came out of COVID. We haven't much to thank COVID for, regrettably, but this is one of the things we can thank COVID for, that it gave her the space and the time to make this extraordinary memoir with its kaleidoscope of just colourful images, all the way from those early days, you know, the connections to Omagh, the connections to Cork, the connections to South Dublin, growing up in, by comparison with the rest of the country, and relative, you were a happy child in a happy home. She's a happy person, actually. As she says herself, Edith's a happy person, and I think that matters a lot in this world. Somebody, shortly after I became president, said to me that people, it was in Cork actually, your mother would have been amazed, and not amazed perhaps, she probably would have understood this. A Cork person said to me that the world divides into two kinds of people, radiators and drains. If you've ever, we've all met drains, right? And they do that. I mean, they just drag the energy out of it. But to meet someone who is a radiator, who actually radiates hope and happiness and optimism, without being either pious or overly optimistic, Edith is that person who just radiates goodness, encouragement, love of life, enthusiasm, that natural scholarly curiosity, and that ability also to laugh at herself, because the book is littered with very self-deprecating stories, most of which I'm pretty sure if you were to ask the people who observed it, they would say, she exaggerates, she didn't do that as badly as she says. But she's a great woman to be able to face failure without any sense of failure, but to say, oh, I learned from that, I moved on from that. That gave me an insight and understanding, and it was one of the most extraordinary things about this amazing Technicolor book, is the life of Edith herself. And by writing, living with my century, she allowed us to, and allows us to live in that century. You know, from, I think of being sent off as a little one, off to England, to boarding school, to a convent. And most of us would be able to write, you know, kind of an Angela's Ashes about that. And the misery of it, and the horror of it. And no, she's full of, you know, jolly hockey sticks and fun, and there's none of that. There's not a trace of self-pity, which makes me wonder, have you any Irish DNA in there? extraordinary thing to read a book where there were plenty of ups and downs in life, but there is no self-pity, none whatever. There's just, this is a learning curve, this is what I have to get through. And then to bring the joy of that, of getting through, as an inspiration to other people. I look at her, she describes brilliantly, of course, because she's a woman of great faith, but not without the scholarly scalpel that she's able to take to so much. I think of how this wonderful UCD woman becomes now the grand dame of TCD. That's an extraordinary thing in itself. I think of the life that brought her in the interwar years, through those years, post the war, her experience of working in the 1950s after the Hungarian uprising with Hungarian refugees in a refugee camp. And these things have coloured and shaped the person that she is and gave her such insight. Meeting her wonderful husband, Albert, the great Catalan, as if she hadn't enough languages. And now you're fluent in Catalan, and then you read in the book that, you know, for fun, she studied Swedish, please, and Russian, and all sorts of other things besides. The scholar. The scholar's penetrating joy in life can't get enough of what life has to offer, and she shares it in the book. I think of the great contribution she made to education on this island, which no book could ever do justice to. The endless committee meetings, the endless pushing, particularly of the role of the university on this island, how important it was, the importance of research, the importance of being student-focused, utterly student-focused, and encouraging students to a level of self-belief that has so many of them living great lives now, thanks to the encouragement she gave them. The bridges of friendship she built all over her life, that for a good deal of her life were focused on exactly that scholarship, reaching out to Germany that she loved so much, explaining Germany to Ireland, explaining Ireland to Germany. Her huge volume of scholarship in that field, but towards the end of the book, in retirement, the story that struck me most, two stories actually that struck me most, were a friendship she struck up with a man that she sort of ran into accidentally, Paddy, and who'd had a tough life he was a hoddsman really, wasn't he? He'd gone off to England to work on the building sites like so many without education. And, you know, this Trinity emeritus professor runs into him, and, not actually runs into him, but meets him, and befriends him, and becomes very important in his life, and he in hers. And that says to me something about the human dignity that she offered everyone she met. That's her calling card, human dignity, that never wavers. Doesn't mean that she would always say incredibly nice things about you. There's a few people, you know, there's a nice scalpel the odd time, but there's always a nice edge to it, you know, and a forgiving, let's say a forgiving edge to it. The other story at the end is your great friend Marianne, who died. You'd known her since school days, and she entered into that awful world of dementia, and you're by her bedside year on year on year, watching that decline. And what I think is extraordinary about this book is how you're able to chart how many of us miss that in our family, in our friends. We miss seeing the little diminutions, the little bits that if we only had picked up on them, wouldn't lead to the eventual chaos that greeted you and greeted her friends. And it's happening all over the country, where as we're living older, getting older and living longer, facing into those times of disappearance of the human person, really, in a way, but standing off and not wanting to intervene, and sometimes leaving it too late. You know, you open the door into a person's home who has lived on their own with dementia, clever people who've covered it up for a very long time. And then you see the chaos that they've been living with. And you chart that brilliantly here, so brilliantly that I think there's another book in this. And I wouldn't be surprised if she hasn't really written actually. But I look at this life, and what do I see? I see a witness to optimism, to diligence, to taking what God gave her, because she has great faith in God, and a great sense of duty and obligation to not just to her faith, but to the gifts that God gave her, to make good use of them, make good use of her time. Diligence, hard work, that open heart, an openness to the world, that there's no barrier that says, well, I can't go there because, I mustn't go there because. Cultural curiosity, wow, she has that in spades. The handshake, the hospitality, the role of education, the passion for women. I mean, we were just saying not that long ago, here we have our first female provost in Trinity, thanks be to God. Sitting beside her, the first registrar. You know, there is a link here, there's a chain. And we probably wouldn't have our first provost if we hadn't had our first female registrar. The first female registrars we heard on these islands. That was the start of thinking afresh, of all those barriers that were in people's minds. You can't do that because you're a woman, starting to tumble. And it's not that long ago that Linda and I were talking that there was a day, a graduation day, when the campus of the university was arranged on the, I actually wasn't there that day as it happened. There was another pro-chancellor, and the entire caput representing the college was all female. The first time in our history that had happened. How did it happen? Well, it happened the day that Edith Sagarra decided that she would take on the role of registrar. It would have been so easy to say no, wouldn't it? Say no, I can't because, but she didn't. And I thank her from the bottom of my heart for the witness that she gave, but also for the way she gave the witness. That it was wrapped up in that beautiful human dignity-oriented personality that comes through in this book. She says herself that it has three themes. You know, it has women and academia and faith. But believe me, there's 1,003 themes in this book. 1,003. And they're all deeply, deeply human. And they're deeply illuminating about the human condition. And it is the kind of book, it's the kind of book I want my daughters to read. I want my son to read. I want my grandsons to read. Because this is the kind of book that introduces them to a world which was tough. You know, born in the intra-war years, lived in very tough times, and still has a big smile for everyone. Hope in life, faith in life, joy in life, fearlessness in life. And she says it herself in the book. She was a happy person. Weren't we lucky? Weren't we lucky? Let's celebrate.
Your Excellencies, and ladies and gentlemen, all my childhood I was looking for attention. I'm getting it in space. And it reminds me that when I got married, the Irish Times in those days used to put wedding notices in the paper. And the next morning I read, Signora Donna Ida Ushi the Sagarra. I said, who is she? And it doesn't behold me as my emeritus retired status to contradict such people as former President, the Chancellor and the Provost. But I didn't really recognise myself. And I'm only going to say really two things. This book has multiple authors. And you don't need to find your name in the text to recognise the part that you have played. My extended family, my friends, and particularly, although I mentioned very few of them because there were too many of them my students. What I want to say is just one thing, that there is so much history encapsulated in a single person's life. And I think I met so many people across what I'm really Macy. I say I'm 80, I say I'm 89, but actually I'm not 89 until August, but I'm beginning to boast about it. I don't think I ever met a single person who wasn't worth listening to. Because I actually had a very happy childhood, and I was one of the fortunate people in life. And I had a great sister who she was good and beautiful, and I was bold. but you know, elder sisters are role models, and the book is dedicated to her. And the other two important people in my life, Miriam, my daughter, and my son, John. So I think everybody should leave, and I mean everybody here and everybody outside should leave a record of their lives. You know, do think about it, whatever form it takes. And then, but another thing I wanted to say was the circumstances of my life have allowed me in Trinity to spend most of my life, and Manchester, to spend most of my life with young people. And some of my young golfing friends here tonight are kind enough to play golf with me at 8 o'clock in the morning. And so I'm still able to make new young friends and older friends as I go through life, which is a wonderful privilege. And what I find, looking back, that being 80, it does, you know, you do creak and you do ache, and you kind of wish you could get out of bed and not have to do exercises to keep going. But what I find is being part of what the Germans call the Greisenalter. Now that sounds like grisly old age, and of course that's exactly what it means. But at the same time, things that used to irritate me like anything, they don't irritate anymore, because I find it tells you a little bit more about human beings, except when you're trying to get up to there and then.
I remember one time talking to the poet John Montague, who was a good friend of Beckett's in Paris, but Montague said, the poet of Beckett said that you know, he could be quite taciturn and wouldn't say much, but after a few glasses of Jameson, you couldn't shut him up. He just keep talking and talking and talking, and in fact it's one of the things I think you talk about, where you say at one point, and it's being kind of pushed back into the picture, you say, so this is the Beckett character in the book saying, I drink to forget who I am. It's an Irish solution if truth be told. Right? So you can see that's kind of the stereotype of the drunken Irishman. But is your work? I mean, that it's not so much about this particular book. Not so much about forgetting, it's about remembering, but remembering the complexities and the vulnerabilities of a person, going beyond the kind of the stereotypical representation of a person or a group of people or whatever. It's bringing dimensions to Beckett that sometimes get forgotten. You know, when Beckett, very often in the French context, we presented as an extremely cerebral, very intellectual writer. Is bringing the emotion back into the picture.
Well, it's very mysterious because he hasn't done, a lot of interviews, so nobody knows the person. I mean, we all know the work, and we don't know much about the man except the wonderful James Nelson's biography. But we don't know much about the man except what we wrote, even in the letters and all that. We don't have much of his voice. We don't have much interviews. So there's something mysterious about the man, and it's funny because. What I thought is it's much more, I don't know how can I say that, but the way he traveled between the two languages, there's a lot of humor and sometimes bad humor between them, and I really like that he could be so able to go to tiny details to very metaphysical questions, and it's the same with the language. I mean, he could have terrible details about, in Molloy and all that, how many farts a day and how many, it can be like that, and can go to very metaphysical questions. And I really like the fact that you could have the whole world in his work, and in his language. And this is so big, that you can have all the details. And the nursing home is a very, very strange place, and it's a very odd word. And when I went to visit, it's a very different place than it was at the time, but people I met said, yeah, he was very happy here, and he had his, he didn't mix much, he didn't want to have his meals with people and all that. but he kind of watched through the window and what was happening in the yard, and even in the letters, it seemed that he was quite not happy, but he found a way to be okay there. And the way he found is from this very rich world he had inside himself, being a writer, being an artist. He had so much inside him that he could bring back, all the memories of what happened to him, but what he read, what he saw, all the paintings, the music, and he could have this alive anytime. And this was maybe the best way to survive in this loneliness of the end of his days. And the fact that he was kind of, joking, like, I'm an old crock now, like I'm in the situation I described all my life. And I thought that he could be, so wise in the way that he could laugh about that and quite enjoy that, like, oh, I can watch myself being one of my own characters. And I find it quite enjoyable, that you can maybe talk about oldness in a way which wasn't sad, wasn't completely hopeless, but could be very creative,
And did you get the impression that in that way you were doing something? We often think of the kind of classic notion of the novel, of the kind of the bildungsroman, which is the kind of the person at a young age, and then they go out into the world and various things happen to them, and eventually there's kind of flowering of the person as they discover their true self. But what you're doing is, it's not a portrait of the artist as a young man, it's the portrait of the artist as the resident of a retirement home, and that it's more, it's a kind of the suggestion that the buildings just goes on endlessly. It's not just a particular period in life. Do you think, or Edward Said talks about the late style. We often think of writers, they do things, they develop, and then there's a point of maturity, and all the rest is kind of decline. And he talks about the late Beethoven, just this explosion of creativity and inquiring spirit. So was that for you the kind of to do the kind of the anti-Bildungsroman some way?
Yeah, I kind of enjoy this idea of a joyful decay, why not?
I like to hear that. It's reassuring.
Yeah, why not? I mean, if you change your perspective, I mean, the physio comes, the word comes to him, that's the very weird thing in a nursing home, he's inside his bedroom and the word comes to him, the physio comes and the nurse comes and people will get him dinner and all that. And everything they say is very formal, it's the institution talking, and I had this idea, like, not I, on like, the very specific laws written in Molloy, like, oh, you have to cycle 2 centimeters from the pavement, he loves this very formal language. So you have all the rules he can read, and it's language, and language is everywhere, in all the signs, in all the formal papers he sees, in all the description of the doctors. And so he became his own creature, like, okay, now I'm there, dug in the sand, and this is the old Sam falling, and this is the old Sam moving, and but he's still the same man, and this is very moving in a way, because he will always be Beckett, and even when he can't talk, when he ends in a coma, he's the same writer, having this creative mind, telling himself sorry, rewriting Joyce's Molloy soliloquy in the last days, and I find it quite moving that there's something that could be the same all lifelong, no matter what memory does to you, no matter what oldness do, something very moving that it kept you the same human being. And I really like this idea, and I find it was a subject in itself, and that Beckett would be the character to tell that story,
You talked about this question of language, and you mentioned earlier, Maylis, the fact that he's moving between English and French, and makes this decision to write in French, and the kind of period when he self-translates into English. And at one point in the book, you have saying, translating myself, incurable linguistic schizophrenia. So there's almost this kind of translated figure or figure in translation, somebody's doing it. I mean, did you have the impression that you yourself became a kind of translator, that you were translating aspects or dimensions of Beckett's life into the French language, the language that he chose to write in? And were you aware of this kind of, the coexist, the pressure, the tension between these two languages that structured Beckett's existence?
Well, I don't think I did anything to him. I don't think he needed me in any ways, but I think it was easier for me to have less inhibition in a foreign word, I like this Irishness and this different language. He had it in mind, and I thought that the older he got and the more English came back to his mind, and English expression that he uses in French, and he's having fun mixing the two, and telling to the nurse, oh, in English would say that, and translating his own expressions, and having still a huge journey inside the two languages, whereas his legs can't help him, go outside. And so it was less, I had less inhibition thinking of English language, and trying to write far from my subject, far from my language, and using the French in a foreign way, which was creative for me, because I thought it's the same problem for everybody. I mean, so many have been written before you, and beautifully written. And in French we have this problem that the 19th century is the great time of the novel, and we can't write like this anymore. It would be really strange. And at the same time, the language seems to be so poor now, and we can't, use this language of the past. So what can we do with that, And Beckett, being from another language, found his way, changing the language and using the French in a very specific way that I can't tell in English. It's a lot of grammar and all that, but the way he used it was very creative, because he had this older language in his mind. And I thought that if I could just think of English and French, and that it would help me find my own voice, would be different to what I read as a French reader, and I find it very inspiring.
So in a way, your French prose is ghosted by the presence of this other language, kind of a haunting of some kind.
Yeah.
One of the, there's a very sort of moving passage in the book where you talk about Saint-Lô, right? So where Beckett goes to after the war to work with the Irish Red Cross, and the beautiful book by Phyllis Gaffney from UCD, who Healing the Ruins, it talks about that Irish Red Cross hospital. And did you? I was wondering about what parts of Beckett's life would you talk about the resistance work in comparison to network, then, or the time that he spends in Roussillon, and that there are references to that. But was the decision to spend more time describing Beckett's time in Saint-Lô deliberate, because what he saw there was first-hand the evidence of the sheer scale of the destruction that had been caused by the Sagarra?
I'm glad you mentioned that, because it has been very heartbreaking to me, because I couldn't really talk about the war, because the book is written as a first person. Beckett is talking, the Beckett character, he's talking, and so I couldn't speak really about the war, because it would have need to give too much information to the reader. It would have changed the voice that I chose. So I decided to end the first part and go straight after the war. And the war was such an important time, because he had to change the way he dealt with life. He was a man very close upon himself, and very inhibited, very distant, and he really had to help people during the war. He had this very important resistance part of his life. He translated for the English, and there was this awful story about this priest who gave them, and this priest who was from Luxembourg, who spoke German, and went to the Nazis at the very beginning of the war and said, I want a wage, I want to have salary every month, and I'll give you everybody you want, and I want a bonus for everyone, I'll give you more, you know? So it was this horrible story, and this man was preaching, and he was preaching very anti-Nazi, you know, because he knew he was protected. And this man entered in the group of resistance where Beckett was, and he gave the group. And this is Robert, he was called Robert Alèche, and this is the most awful story. And Beckett had the time to run away, and he ran away with Suzanne, and it was a very, very difficult time for him. And after that, because his friends were killed and deported, and he had to live with that. And after the war, when he went back to Ireland, he couldn't go back to France because everybody was checked, and what was this Irish man from a neutral country wanted to go back to France, so he had to go with the Red Cross. It wasn't his choice, you know. And so the mission was to rebuild a hospital in Saint-Lô, and Saint-Lô is called Capitale des Ruines in France. It's 95% destructed during the war, after D-Day and all, and it was a nightmare. The whole city was a nightmare after the war. And he arrived there with the Red Cross and decided to rebuild the hospital, was the mission. And he met all these strange characters. I mean, death was everywhere, and they got drunk every evening with the doctors, and you know, and go to see prostitutes. And it was a kind of Eros and Thanatos, you know, period of his life. But after that, after all he saw during the war, and after all his work came out, as if it was the great experience he needed, because before the war he was a kind of writer who wasn't writing. I mean, except the first book, Murphy, he wasn't writing. There was huge inhibitions he couldn't get over. And then the war arrived, and much more important things arrived, that he had to do the job, you know, after the war. And it was also a tribute to all the horrors he has seen.
The enthusiast was very well built, hairy as a yeti, with chest hair overflowing from his press-button tunic. A booming voice emerged from his larynx, using nuances of language which I was not sure I quite understood. He made a point of taking out a big notebook from which hung a transparent, retractable, red ballpoint pen, before pronouncing the following enigmatic sentence. Off you go, Mr. Beckett. This is a test of your balance, based on the Berg balance scale. He felt it necessary to complete the sentence with the following turn of phrase. Let's get the show on the road, Joe.
N'ayant pas encore obtenu d'explications précises, ni sur le kiki évoqué, ni sur les tenants et aboutissants exacts de la manœuvre qu'il me serait demandé d'accomplir, je décidai dans un premier temps de passer sur la familiarité de l'ours. Peut-être était-ce lui le kiki en question, je commençais à le penser, considérant qu'il y avait somme toute une certaine cohérence entre l'esprit de la bête et son allure. Nous n'en étions encore qu'au début des présentations, lorsque l'animal revint à la charge, me suggérant tout un tas d'acrobaties auxquelles je me soumis avec la foi inébranlable d'un enfant de paroisse. « Monsieur Beckett, veuillez vous lever en essayant de ne pas vous aider avec vos mains, s'il vous plaît. » Je fis un essai, avant de me rattraper de justesse. Nouvelle tentative, nouvel échec, pas mieux. Attendez, je coche, peut se lever seul, mais avec l'aide de ses mains. On continue, c'est reparti. Dieu nous préserva d'une autre rime.
Since he had given me no precise instructions as to the movements he wanted me to perform, and had failed to identify the Joe in question, I decided not to take issue with the overfamiliar form of address that the Yeti had employed. Was he himself the Joe in question? That was what I had begun to believe. there was, all things considered, a form of coherence between the body and the mind of the creature. We had scarcely got started with the exercises when the beast went at it again, suggesting a whole range of physical jerks which I undertook with the good faith of a holy communicant. "Mr. Beckett, please stand up without using your hands." I gave it a go, and just about caught myself in time, tried again, failed again, no better. "Wait a second, I'm ticking the box for can stand up unaided, aided by his hands. Off we go again, get the show on the road."
Plague, known as COVID-19, is still around. A once young woman was clearing out her attic in Florida, USA, when she came across a former lover's logbook and returned it to its owner in the English Midlands 46 years later. Michael Chapman, pitcher. And he, by Joycean happenstance, wrote up this long-lost log and returned this message in a bottle to me in this tale about my father, his mistress, and their cat. He, my father, found escape and fulfillment, as many sailors do, in the sea that forms 2/3 of the surface of our planet. And so this vivid story by his deckhand on his journey across the Atlantic is both elemental and universal. It was on my father's boat, the Gay Gander, that I was afforded the time and leisure to read Ulysses, a life-transforming event, as I recount in a note to Michael's wonderful book. And that enabled me to present the long-lost log to you this evening, with a magical glimpse into the past that has become a future present. The I Ching perhaps has a key to all we did not know. Indeed, it was literature and that form of fulfillment that led me to our guest speaker, my friend Ed Maggs, London's bookseller in chief. It was at the Magg Brother premises in Berkeley Square, which provided a launching pad at Cape Canaveral for our keynote 2010 edition by Dennis Rose of Joyce's Finnegan's Wake, when our speaker was Edna O'Brien. I remind you, if I may, of the opening sentence of this majestic work. River run past Eve and Adams from swerve of shore to bend of bay, brings us by commodious vicus of recirculation back to Hoath Castle and environs. How fitting that we have returned to shore by Bend of Bay on the scraggy isthmus of Europe Minor to welcome and celebrate this book. I subsequently discovered Ed's great love of and connection to the sea, and indeed to Ireland. I'm honoured to have him speak in Michael's book. My profound thanks to both himself and to Michael. Ed.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you, Antony. The real reason he asked me to speak tonight is I've got a notably loud voice, and so it had to be today that I lost it. And so I'm a little bit croaky, but I'm delighted that we've got a PA system. Antony's already hinted at the publishing history of it, which is absolutely extraordinary, because it offers the publisher an opportunity to meet with his father in a way that none of us are normally given the opportunity to, through the eloquent and well-informed eyes of another, of someone who was there. Our parents are to us typically a mystery, and one of the keys for Michael's books is an exploration of the bafflement of the generations, and the discourse between Carlo and John and you is full of the utter incomprehension for my parents' generation of what I was going through. We're so much luckier these days where we can understand our children. Singing Iggy Pop songs on the way to school isn't something that my father could do. We'll be lived in a completely alien world. The book itself is therefore a sort of miracle of surrogacy. It reads like a father and son, Edmund Goss's classic account of his father, albeit a father and son written by Frank Harris, the famous pornographer. We can't get away from the sex in this book, it's central to it. It's a book that doesn't fit in any particular genre. It blends, it overlaps genres, they lay over each other. We've got a classic coming of age story. I take issue with the subtitle because there's very little evidence of a virgin sailor. He may have been new to boats, but there's a lot of experience. But Michael himself is, I haven't met him till today. I feel like I've known him for a long time now, having read the book several times and having immersed myself in the world. But previous to this, I had to stalk him on the internet, which is what the internet was given. And he's a very difficult person to pin down. In many roles, you can find Michael, who had a senior but mysterious role at IBM. You find Michael, who was the head of IT at Crossrail, which ended. I think there's an employment tribunal in there somewhere. This is all on the internet. I'm not blowing anything, but maybe. He is an insect campaigner, not for the rights of insects, but for exploring why the insect population of the world is crashing. There's an exceptionally good talk by him on the internet, which, if it doesn't frighten you, you haven't got an imagination about how the insect life. Apparently, is someone called Mickey the Mole Catcher in Pershore, who either as an allegorical pest control officer or an actual pest control officer. Actual pest control officer, there we go. And to all of those different qualifications can be added the fact that he is now unambiguously a writer. This is a well-written book. It's expressive, it's concise, it's neat. It has a sense of place, a sense of smell, little details like Corola's perfume. And this is one of the other elements of this is the it's not quite a knife in the water with that extraordinary tale of what goes wrong with a triangle of relationships on a small boat. Even though Antony's father, who was a good shot, I believe, if he had meant to be firing his revolver at Michael, he would have got him. But nevertheless, the revolver is fired, and Michael's head wasn't far from it. And as Antony said, this is of course the year of Ulysses. One can't get away from it, and Antony talks about his own moment of greatest intimacy with his father, being sailing around the Ionian Islands, I think, in this same boat, in Gay Gander, and reading Ulysses. And this is probably partly why he's a publisher. And again, back to Ulysses, you can't avoid the sex in your book, and you can't avoid it in Ulysses. And there's although there's no coprophagia or strict discipline in Michael's book, James Joyce never wrote about the things that a young woman in Portugal did with cigarettes. Michael does. Quite extraordinary. My response to reading this book was initially, I'm afraid, this is fantasy. This is someone making it up. But I realised that this was demonstrating my failings, because Michael was describing a girl in every port. He was describing the lifestyle that I always wanted as an adolescent. I wanted to be Michael. I went on my own rites of passage things and spent a whole year travelling around, including in Greece, not losing my virginity. It was an astonishingly difficult thing to do in retrospect, but I was a hopeless young man. But it is true. We were saying earlier that honesty is a complicated thing. It involves two components. One is fact, one is truth. I suspect some of Michael's facts may be a little bit mobile, but this is a very true book. It is an emotionally honest book. It's about time for me to pass on to Mick, but there's one thing I need to say, that he concludes that he was very lucky to be with Antony's father, John. And I'd just like to say that John, I'm sure, he handed you a bill at the end of this. After you got him across the Atlantic, he handed you a bill and told you not to forget it, to pay it. But I'm sure John realises how lucky he was to have you. And the best novice sailor I have ever sailed with was also was an ASM, a theatrical type. And theatrical types, despite their reputation, are the most disciplined and rigorous of people. They know if it doesn't happen then, it doesn't happen on cue, it's all over. And so you understood the urgency of things. You may also understood the mechanisms that Tony explained to you. Anyway, he was very lucky to have you. And I think we're very lucky to have you here, Michael. And I think you're going to talk a bit more about the book. You're going to read us some passages from it.
Yes.
Are we going to get the cigarette passage?
No. Oh. Well, I'd like to thank you all very much for coming here. Up until this point, I've suffered from imposter syndrome, because suddenly becoming a writer is a difficult thing. You've got to get over a lot of hurdles. You've got to write, then you've got to find a sympathetic publisher, then you've got to get the book out, and then you've got to start selling them. Thank you very much for buying some tonight. It's already just exceeded 1,000 copies in not a long time. Thank you very much. So, in sailing terms, the book has caught the wind. And I was rather, worried about when I was writing it. But when I started off, this log came back to me. And a very dear friend, who's now sadly passed, from this parish called Kieran Fogarty, looked at my first draft and threw it in the bin and said it's rubbish. And I had another go, and he said it's worse rubbish. And he was a fearsome man and never minced his words. And then he said, you have to write this book. This log has come back to you. It's a diary. You have to write it as though you don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. And you cannot put in anything you've learned since. So quite a lot of time has passed. And I managed to start pulling the trick off. And I was writing, and I had source material. I had a couple of letters that I'd written to my sister, and so there was various bits that I managed to start gathering together. So the book has now appeared, it's finally presented, and Antony has done a beautiful job with it. When I came over here, he took me to the, I better not reveal the place, but where some of the old books go to rest. And he said to me, I've never pulped a book in my life. Oh. And I publish books on paper that won't deteriorate. And my job is to curate Irish literature and to make sure it's there for everyone now and in the future. And there are some copies of books which, are yet to sell or haven't sold, so they're up here. And I said, I wonder if my book will be up here one day. He said, you'll never come back and find out. I've come to Ireland several times, and in fact, because my grandfather was born here, there's a passport application in somewhere. Honestly, you never know. Might be back in the EU yet. But I've come a number of times, and one of the times I came down to a storytelling festival in Sneem, County Kerry. And it was a joy because you learn to get the pace and lilt of the Irish storytelling tradition, and great that was. And I was driving an old Morris Minor at the time, and I was driving up the Wild Atlantic Way. And going up there, I fell in love with the place. And I suddenly realised that this was part of me somewhere. The gin clear air, the wonderful cliffs, the whole thing. And I wrote a song. And I wrote a song, and I put that song into a competition. And I went and I sang that song in front of the people, and the Minister of Tourism was there. And I won the room with the song. When it came to divvying up the prize, €2,000. I came third. A medal. And the minister came up to me and said, whatever gave you the idea that an Englishman could come to County Kerry and walk away with the gold? From Donegal to County Cork by way of Clew Bay, I played along the shore of the wild Atlantic Way. High cliff mountain to where dolphin play, I fell for the spell of the charm of the wild Atlantic Way. Now footfall grow tall, tall as a king or queen, a soft refrain of sun and rain fall on emerald green. Soft night, warm bright, walk a crooked trail, surf the ever-rolling waves, hear the banshee wail. She wail from Donegal to County Cork by way of Galway Bay. I played along the shore of the wild Atlantic Way. High cliff mountain, smack of the ocean spray. I fell for the spell of the charm of the wild Atlantic way. Now in me was an ember burning to be a flame, and I blew it bright on a Friday night at a bar called the Rainbow's End. From Donegal to County Cork by way of Bantry Bay, I fell for the spell of the charm of the wild Atlantic way. Warm fire, a local liar, friendly folk and crack, tales to tell, hearts to swell. And I'm coming back, I'm coming back. High cliff mountain, whirling birds of prey. I fell for the spell of the wild Atlantic way. Fell for the spell of the magic coast. Fell for Ireland's wild Atlantic way. Fell for Ireland's wild romantic way.